Hello everybody, it's Silver. This is Flintlock, the Siege of Dawn. So this is a Souls-like. It's actually really more of a Souls-like melded with like new God of War ideas, so it's kind of in between. It's set in a pretty interesting world that is a combination of your sort of early Flintlock era gunpowder usage, but also like fantasy. So we've got undead and invading gods and stuff like that, but we've also got people just shooting other people in the face. And you play as a sapper, which is why you use an axe and explosives and stuff, and you sort of were involved in some potential unleashing of the gods, and now you've got to kind of put everything back together. And in this case, that entails going across the continent to various big cities and destroying the sort of godly manifestations and stuff that are there to sort of put them all back down. And this is a very mechanically rich game, I would call it. I was really surprised, honestly. I didn't know exactly what to expect. I knew the genre going into this game, but I didn't expect such a large bit of like competent design in terms of just many new ideas and a lot of other interesting things. So there's a lot of mechanics here to explain, but the basics are what you would expect at first, right? You've got your light attack and heavy attack, and you've got a lot of enemies to use them on. Now, one somewhat familiar addition to the Souls-like formula that we've seen in games like Bloodborne is the addition of an offhand firearm, and you do have one of those. You've got various kinds of pistol and some other things like that you can carry in your offhand and use during battle. It has 3 charges at first, although this is determined by the weapon you're using, as well as some of the other gear can change this, and you regain charges by hitting enemies, so you don't have ammo in the traditional sense for this weapon. Instead, it's refilling charges. However, it doesn't exactly work like the Bloodborne guns, because those were used as a parry mechanism, and in this case, they work a little bit differently from that. If you shoot someone right before they do a normal attack, it won't really do anything different. It might interrupt them, but it won't parry them. No, you actually have a parry, a specific guard function that you use for that. You can just guard like normal, but if you guard right before you get hit, then you'll parry, and it tends to open them up for huge counter damage, so it's a really good idea to parry as often as possible. Instead, there are unblockable attacks that have a sort of red glow to them, and these are where you use your firearm. If you use your pistol on an unblockable attack, it will interrupt them and usually cause them to kneel down for a second, giving you a free hit or two. Now, you actually have quite a lot of equipment on you at any given time. In addition to your handgun, you've also got 2 secondary weapons that can be much larger, like muskets or cannons and things like that. And you can just swap to these at any time just by holding the left trigger, and you'll start aiming one. Although they are all manually reloaded in a reload sequence that does take a while, but it is an active reload. And if you press the button again right as the gauge reaches the colored spot, wherever it is, then you will reload much faster and often get a damage bonus for the next shot and some other stuff like that. So it's definitely worth doing, and if you don't active reload, then it takes a while, so you really don't want to be doing it mid-combat most of the time. But these secondary weapons are often really powerful. They tend to have a very high damage and just like really good single target damage oftentimes. Like your musket is basically a sniper rifle. You can use it at quite a distance, and it even has a slow motion zoom in on the musket ball if you get a headshot with it sometimes. So yeah, it's your sort of deal with one specific enemy at a time kind of weapon, but you can also get some other stuff like hand mortars that leave fire on the ground, or big heavy cannons that shoot really slow but fire a ricocheting projectile that can chain between multiple enemies at once, things like that. So this is sort of the realm of your extra options, from taking care of really long distance enemies, or specifically enemies that you don't want to get close to, or for dealing with large groups of weaker enemies. There are lots of different secondary weapons that will fulfill different roles. You also have 2 primary weapons at any given time, your melee weapons. These are usually axes, because you're a sapper, and they are really all quite powerful. I've noticed they tend to do a lot of damage to enemies, but enemies also do a lot of damage to you back, and there isn't a traditional armor system in the game. There is armor you can equip, but there isn't like an armor value that reduces damage you take. Most of the time you're taking full damage in this game. But yeah, your primary weapons tend to be really strong and have different characteristics, from a nice basic axe that just does good hit stun, to something that sets enemies on fire, to something that gets more powerful the more of a combo you've built up. Also, all of your primary and secondary weapons are independently upgradable and will get significantly stronger throughout the game as you gather the resources to upgrade them. The upgrade system is very similar to like a Dark Souls upgrade system. It works pretty much in the same way. You've also got a charge-based healing item that is like an Estus Flask, and the whole charge-based thing is kind of interesting because this game takes that idea and really runs with it. Your healing item is not the only charge-based consumable that you have. Like, for instance, those secondary firearms I mentioned, they also have ammo, but it's not ammo that you find and loot from bodies in the world or anything. It's charge-based ammo that is restored when you go back to a checkpoint. And also, you can have 2 different grenades equipped. Each of those also have a charged number of uses, rather than a number of consumable grenades that you loot. However, another mechanic that's very important to all of this working correctly is the god that follows you around in the form of an adorable little fox creature thing. And this little dude can attack enemies independent of you. You just press the Y button and he will dive through them and attack them. You can actually do this even while you're attacking, and in fact there are certain skills on the skill tree that cause you to do additional damage if you do them at the same time. But because he acts completely independently of you, that means even when you're getting hit and in hit stun, or when you're rolling or doing something that means you can't also attack, he can still attack if you press the button. However, he has those little purple triangles in the bottom right of the screen that show you the number of times he can attack, and these simply refill quickly over time, so you can't like spam his attack infinitely, but you can chain several together at a time. His attack doesn't really do much damage in the way of just like pure raw health damage, but it does build up this purple gauge and also inflict them with this thing called the Curse of Death. The Curse of Death makes your attacks also fill up that purple gauge. That purple gauge is really important. It's sort of like a stagger gauge. Once it's full, the enemy will be stunned for a minute and you can do an attack that does massive damage to them, often killing them outright. There are also enemies that can have shields or armor, and if they have a shield, the first time you do one of these attacks or parry them, you'll actually rip the shield away from them and they'll have to fight the rest without it. But if they're armored, then their health gauge will be a sort of silvery color to show that it's protected, and they'll take very little damage from most of your attacks, although there is one hammer that you can get that is specifically an anti-armor weapon. But aside from that, you don't really do much damage to an armored enemy. But if you were able to fill that purple gauge and then do one of the big riposte style of attacks, then it will break their armor off, and their health gauge will be unprotected. This mechanic is required for surviving boss fights. You will need to build up this gauge multiple times on bosses in order to beat them, because many of them are armored, and even the ones that are not have a lot of health, and you really need these big riposte attacks to go off in order to be able to beat them in a timely fashion. You can also find these glowing stones that you can equip to the little fox dude, and they'll actually float above his ears when you have one equipped, which is pretty cute. But these will cause additional curses to be inflicted whenever he attacks. So he still inflicts the Curse of Death no matter what, but these add extra ones, like a curse that poisons enemies, or a curse that builds up bleeding. Bleeding works like Dark Souls bleeding, not damage over time, but instead a big burst of damage when it procs. There's also a huge attack on that big purple diamond. When it fills up, you can use a sort of ult, and there are several different ones you can equip. The first one you start with is like a big AoE dark damage sort of burst, big nova around you that is very effective against normal enemies. It tends to kill them in one hit, and will take a big chunk of health off of more elite enemies or bosses. But you can get some other ones that are really useful, like one that causes your weapons to fire forward these blades of energy that deal good damage at range and also help to build that purple gauge up a lot. This is heavily parry-based combat, especially in boss fights, because parrying a boss doesn't give you that immediate huge riposte damage that it does for a normal enemy, but it does build up the purple gauge a lot faster if you're able to do it. And while fighting normal enemies, it's just a good way to dispatch them very quickly. So this is the kind of combat where you are expected to parry very often. It is a highly rewarded action to parry correctly, so you really need to do it as much as you can. And this is also the kind of game where dodging is useful, but it's more of a Bloodborne dodge. It's not a dodge roll, it is a sort of dodge dash that has very short immunity frames. It does have them, but they're really, really precise. You can also double tap the button to use some gunpowder to do more of a sort of gunpowder-fueled dodge roll that is more about clearing distance rather than immunity frames. It's just about getting you physically out of the way. You also have a lot of mobility in this game. From the start, once you get the god's powers, he will enchant your gunpowder and you can use it for various things. So you have a double jump that's actually powered by throwing gunpowder at your feet. And you have a sort of air dash that allows you to clear a good amount of distance in the air that you use by throwing gunpowder behind you. You can also slide a good distance down slopes, and you combine all these things together to make a really fun traversal system that means exploring the world feels really good because it's just fun to move around. The way the movement feels in this game is really nice. You'll also find these crystal skulls on occasion that will open up these extra paths when you get to them, so you want to reach them for shortcuts and things. They open up these sort of purple portals that allow you to combine with your fox for a while and dash through the sky and clear a ton of distance really fast. And at first these might seem like sort of scripted areas where you have to go in a straight line, but later on you'll find a lot of them that are in very open areas and have multiple directions you can go and stuff, and you can actually leave these portals in several different ways depending on what button you press. You can press one button to simply drop out of one, you can press another to do a big high jump off of it, you can press another to do a big forward dash that takes you a really long distance, so you have a lot of freedom when it comes to exploration because of all these different traversal mechanics all put together. It means that just exploring around the world is really fun. There is also another unusual mechanic that it takes a normal thing from like a Souls-like and changes it a bit in a way I've never seen before. So this game has a system called reputation, which are your souls. It's your currency. You know, you use reputation to level yourself up and to buy stuff at merchants and things. They are souls, and you get them mostly from killing enemies, but in this case, you don't get them immediately. Instead, as you kill enemies, you build up a sort of pool of reputation that is amplified by a percentage based on how good you're doing. So as you're continuing to build up combos and use various different mechanics very well, it'll make this percentage go up more and more. And at any point you want, you can press a button to cash in the reputation that's in that pool that will then combine with that multiplier to give you an amplified amount over what you would normally get. So if you're doing really well and you've got like a 75% multiplier going, then you'll get 75% bonus added to it and get a whole bunch more reputation than what the enemies themselves are normally worth. But if you get hit at any point or just take damage from anything, even damage over time effects, then it'll zero out that percentage and just give you the base amount of reputation. So the idea is like a risk-reward concept. You know, you want to keep this reputation pool going like a betting pool almost, and do better and better and get this percentage higher and higher before finally cashing it all in, at the risk of completely destroying that entire multiplier by taking a hit of damage. The armor system is also a little bit unusual. You have two different armor slots, your sort of tunic and your pants, that are completely cosmetic. They don't offer any stats at all, they're just for looks. But you also have three other armor slots that are for more than just looks. You've got a pauldron, a gauntlet, and a helmet. And you'll find each one of these at various points throughout the world, just different kinds of them that you can equip, and they all have various different, usually very powerful effects. I've noticed that the armor effects in this game tend to be really, really strong. They also all have a set bonus, and the set is always of 2. The sets are 2 pieces large, so you need 2 pieces to activate a set, which means you can only have 1 set bonus at a time because you have 3 slots. But there is a skill on the skill tree that you can get much later that allows you to activate 2 set bonuses as long as you have both parts of one of them. The skill tree is also really important because it's the main way you're going to get stronger. There is no leveling up in this game. There aren't stats like strength and intelligence and things like that. Instead, you have a list of different powerful passive benefits on this skill tree. And you start kind of at the bottom and then just move up. And there are sort of 3 triangular bits that one is all about guns, one is about your main melee weapons, and one is about the god powers. And they sort of meld at different points as you go through these sort of triangularly shaped skill trees. And as you get more towards the top, these skills get more and more expensive, and they start to get ridiculously expensive. You need a lot of reputation to get some of the top stuff. You might need like 2,000 reputation to get a basic thing in the bottom of the tree, and then you might need like 25,000 to get some of the stuff at the very top. Enemy variety is something that I always want to mention in a Souls-like because that's one of the things that some people get wrong. It's very good, almost necessary really, to have a good variety of relatively complex enemies that have good mechanics to fight against in order to actually make your combat system stand out, because all this shiny stuff that you can do is only as effective as the enemies that are there for you to use them on. And I would say in that regard the game does relatively well. It does not have a tremendous amount of enemy variety, but it has a good amount of enemy variety, and a lot of them are somewhat smart when their AI doesn't break, and are pretty good at expecting what you can do. You know, they'll try and take you out at a range with ranged weapons, and then they'll switch to melee weapons up front rather than just trying to shoot you at point blank range. They'll often try to parry you and stuff, which some of them can actually do. And some of the more humanoid bosses are capable of a pretty large number of different attacks that you've got to learn. This is also important because of the settlement system. You'll come across settlements that are taken by the enemy factions of the game, and you have to make it to the coffee shop of the settlement, which seems to be based on like ancient Turkish coffee from what I can tell. And around that coffee shop will be a boss enemy for you to take on, a humanoid one usually. And once you take them out, then you will liberate that particular settlement. Everyone will come back to it. It'll be a hub for fast travel, as well as for some upgrades and for getting new side quests and stuff. So your adventure is a relatively linear one. It's not an open world game, but it is interspersed with these sort of optional settlement taking bits that allow you to expand what you can do. In terms of difficulty, I would say it's a relatively challenging game, but it's not super crazy hard. It's not like Bloodborne hard. It is, however, still relatively difficult. It is above the average for the sort of action RPG genre, I would say, especially in the boss fights. Some of them do get quite challenging, although I find that this is a game where you will get so strong by like the late game that stuff stops being able to really stop you. But I would say this is definitely worth playing if you like Souls-likes or you just like action RPGs that are on the slightly more difficult side. It is a really fun time, and like I said, it's a very mechanically rich game. The combat, the main focus of the game, has a lot of fun mechanics to it that makes it really satisfying, and things like the enemy models, the weapon models, and the animation quality, those more side things, are also really good, so that helps to add to the experience of the game. And when you combine that with some really fun traversal and a fun world to explore, then yeah, I'd say it's definitely worthwhile. I was very surprised after some time with this. It's got its problems, it's got some weird wonky hitboxes and some bosses that I feel are not balanced at all, but for the most part I still had a really good time with it, and I'm pretty happy to recommend it, I think. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Flintlock if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.